Molly, Britt, and Savannah, and we're Group 2, and welcome to our talk show, Are You All In?
Our project was focused on the famous and historic Tillman Hall. Tillman Hall is arguably the most iconic building on campus, and we wanted to know more about it and the person who it's named after.
Do y'all know who it's named after?
I'm Benjamin Ryan Tillman. So today we're going to have an open discussion about who Tillman is and what he's about, mainly focusing on what most people know and don't know about him and the building.
So to get started, who is Benjamin Tillman?
Benjamin Tillman is a South Carolinian born and raised. He was born in the Edgefield district of South Carolina on August 11th in 1847. He lived to be the ripe old age of 70 years old and died in 1918. He was raised by mostly his mother on a plantation after his father died when he was about 2 years old. He was educated, had a wife, 7 children. He fought for the Confederate State Army and was an all-around Carolina man.
So what was his political standpoint?
Benjamin Tillman was a Democrat, and along with this, he had a lot of the ideals that the time period had. He was very for farmers, and he was also very against African Americans. He was one of the men who helped set up a poll tax, educational and property requirements, and a subject test which allowed the people giving the test to fail someone as soon as they seemed it right. So, of course, African Americans really didn't get the right to vote.
So he was really Jim Crow.
He was very for Jim Crow laws. He was one of the guys who helped enlist that. Along with that, he was the senator for the U.S. government. He was a senator for 24 years, and some of his highlights were he helped with the Hepburn Bill in 1906, which helped regulate railroads, and he also had his own Tillman Act in 1907, which instituted campaign finance. So,
For him or for his party?
for his entire party, actually. Along with that, he was very for colonization, cool legacies to be known, but most of them were fights, kind of like little cat fights. He was very against President Roosevelt and Booker T. Washington, mostly because of their policies, again, for African Americans.
Oh, did you know that after he died, Booker T. Washington actually came here to speak, and he hated him so much?
I didn't know.
I know, I just thought that was
absolutely crazy.
Hilarious.
He also gave several speeches, one of his most famous ones being the race problem. This was where he mostly talked about the ignorance of African Americans and how they have a heavy presence, especially in a lot of rural places in South Carolina, which, I mean...
Yeah, they were on plantations.
They still
they
do.
were, yeah. He also hated Republicans, calls them out, and tells them to get out of our state. So, great guy.
Wow.
Yeah.
So overall, what was his impact on South Carolina?
He was our governor. He was a part of the Red Shirts. He also helped with the installation of Jim Crow laws. And then one of his biggest things was he participated in a massacre shortly before his election.
So people knew about the massacre before they elected him?
Yes,
And they still elected him?
he advertised his participation in the massacre and was very proud of it. What happened was he participated in, it was called the Hamburg Massacre, funny name, but what it was on July 4th in 1876, a black militia, a very small one, was celebrating Independence Day. So they had a small parade of arms and drills. It was in a very rural place. They didn't think they would be in anyone's way. Well, a wagon of 2 white men came through and wanted them to cease fire while they passed through on a tiny road.
Wow.
Well, what they thought was a tiny road. The men explained to them that if they had backed up a little bit and went around, then they could have bypassed them completely, and the militia could continue going on through and finishing their celebration.
Yes.
Well, this did not go over very well, and even though the militia eventually allowed the wagon to go through, it ended with the leader of the militia, Adams, being arrested and taken to a courthouse, where he was met with an angry mob of over 100 white men.
Wow.
Yeah, and Tillman was one of them. So what happened was, when he saw all of these men, he got really scared, and he ran to an armory in which a lot of other African Americans, about 40, came and joined him. Throughout this whole thing, about 6 or 7 people died, one of them being white, and about 6 being African American. And that was when the African Americans surrendered their arms. They came out, and that's when they basically were attacked.
Wow.
By white men. Yeah.
And then he advertised that before before his election.
Oh yes, he did. He was very proud of his acts for South Carolina.
Wow. Okay. So, what about his relationship with Thomas Clemson?
They were basically best friends. They had known each other, they were both very politically involved, and Clemson had told Tillman his plans for his land and what he wanted done for it before he died. Tillman was on the will. He helped fight for the land that Clemson had left.
Oh, so did he have any future plans with Clemson?
Yes, he, even though Clemson had said in his will that he wanted his land to be dedicated to a mix of agriculture and education, the government really didn't want that. They wanted to use his land to mostly just produce food and crops. So Tillman helped fight for the will, establish the college in the 1890s, but the only problem was he only wanted white students to attend. Clemson had never directly said in his will whether it only had to be African Americans or white students attending his college. He left it open to the times, but Tillman only wanted
Caucasian students.
he only wanted Caucasians to attend college.
So this is why Tillman helped with the South Carolina State University, so they would be completely separate. But you know what they say, separate but equal.
Yeah.
Okay.
He did the same thing with Winthrop. He has a building over there too named after him, and he was very for the same ideals. He also, one of the last things that he did for Clemson was he established the convict labor camp that helped build most of the buildings.
Oh.
Yeah, he did do at least 11 pardonings of people who worked on the labor, but he was the one who established it.
Yeah.
Did you guys know that there was over like 550 men that was on the convict labor team, and at least 530 of them were African American?
What's crazy is we still use these buildings.
Buildings every
but
day.
We don't even know
Which ones were built?
Yeah, by them.
So was it named before Tillman? What was it named before Tillman? I'm sorry.
When Tillman Hall was created, it was originally called the Main. It had our first libraries, classrooms, laboratories, and it had a chapel. But it was later renamed in 1946 to Tillman Hall to honor Ben Tillman, one of the original successors. And that happened during the 50th anniversary of the school first graduating class on the behalf of his son, William.
So what is Tillman Hall?
Well, first of all, when you do a Google search, what's the first building you see?
You see Tillman Hall.
You see Tillman Hall. So it's like the most iconic building on campus. But it was built in 1894, which was just 5 years after the university was built. But funny enough, it caught on fire in 1893, and everything but the exterior was destroyed. So they had to re-renovate the entire thing. And a lot of people think it's all one gigantic building, but there is actually an auditorium that's attached to it. And this seats about 755 people. And that's the space that we use for our concerts, some lectures. John Mulaney, that's where he's coming to speak.
Oh.
And
they have probates there also.
Yeah, they do. And it was also first it was the Memorial Chapel. That's where they had their church.
Interesting.
So, have there been any changes or modifications other than the ones after the fire?
Yeah, the bell that was in there that was added in 1985, and the clock wasn't in the original design. It wasn't added till after 1906.
I didn't know that.
That's so cool. And the first ever clock, they had to take it out because it was getting old. But if you go to the Daniel Floor Engineering Building, you can actually see it. And they worked with the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors, and they actually remodeled the clock, and now it works perfectly fine.
That's interesting.
And the original bell, if you look in the Curling Gardens, that's the original bell from the tower.
It's one of the graduation traditions that everyone goes and puts their hands on it, right? After they.
I did not know that.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, they all go and hit the bell.
Dang, I did that.
That's
Does that
cute.
mean I'm not gonna graduate?
I guess so.
All right. So what's the building used for?
Well, today's the home of education. That's where most of their classrooms are, and we still use it a lot.
Or don't want to forget, nor honor his actions as a person, especially his race riots, violent racism, and bigotry. For a lot of people, including myself, I don't consider a building named after someone to mean nothing. Having a building named after you is an honor, especially when it's such a symbol of Clemson like Old Main. It doesn't support our current President Clement's purpose of promoting diversity and inclusion when the focal point of a campus glorifies a racist, especially in 2018 with this political climate. And after such events such as Charlottesville, keeping these monuments up is a way of tolerating neo-Nazis and white supremacists. I'm not saying by having a building named after him, the university is saying, oh, we love like hate groups. It's not like that. But it doesn't denounce him either by keeping the monument up. So in this case, as in many cases, not saying or changing anything is almost as bad as just being a bystander.
But a lot of people oppose to renaming it. Like, what are some reasons for that?
Oh, so after doing a lot of research and trying to figure out why people are so against it, I found that most agree that renaming Tillman is an attempt to erase history. In an article I read by the Tiger News, the author quotes Governor Haley's speech when she says, "You learn to accept history for what it is, but you also try to change history. Changing the name of Tillman Hall doesn't erase history. What we need to do is look forward instead of looking back." He also agrees that because Tillman is dead, nobody here has been personally offended by his actions, so it isn't him that we should be worrying about, but the people today that are showing ill will towards others. It's an interesting argument for sure, and I can see how many people think that a building rename would do nothing to show that, oh, like, his actions then don't mean anything now, but they really do, because he isn't alone. In 2015, a Board of Trustees member, David Wilkins, said, "Some of our historical stones are rough and even unpleasant to look at, but they are ours, and denying them as a part of history does not make them any less so. For that reason, we will not change the name of our historical buildings." At face value, in 2018, it can be easy to accept what he said and just continue to walk by and accept it as, oh, we tried, but oh well, like, it's always going to be Tillman. We're always just going to have a racist monument on our campus. It's just so important to note that it was renamed in 1946, however. Jim Crow laws were still heavily enforced in South Carolina and the rest of the former Confederate states. And this is 17 years after the first black student enrolled, 29 years after Tillman died. So renaming the building wasn't simply to honor a great former senator, governor, donor to Clemson. It was a power play to express the white supremacist stronghold over the university.
If we were to go forward with renaming the building, what would be the process for doing that?
One would think it's an easy process, as like taking down a sign and printing some new maps. There are a few barriers to get through, however. First, the Board of Trustees has a policy that claims, under extraordinary circumstances, when the continued use of a name would compromise the public trust and reflect adversely upon the university, Clemson University reserves the right to rename the building or facility. However, because recently in 2016, many of the historic buildings on campus, such as Holdendorf, Hardin, the Trustee House, Godfrey, Long, and others, including Tillman, were added to the National Registry of Historic Buildings, renaming is now in the hands of the South Carolina General Assembly. The Heritage Act of 2000 states that dedicated in memory or named of any historical figure or historic event may not be renamed or rededicated. It applies to streets, buildings, bridges, parks, preserves, reserves, and other public areas. And it would take 2/3 vote by the General Assembly to make any provisions to the law, the Act says. So, when students at Winthrop University, just down the 85, made it known to their own Board of Trustees their desires to have Tillman Hall, their response was along the lines of it being too difficult to garner the support of the General Assembly to make an exception. What did Clemson have to say about this? Nothing. So, I think if we really wanted to change it, it would take a wave of student advocacy and protests for them to change the name.
So, if we're talking about changing Tillman, should we be renaming other buildings too?
We definitely should rename the other buildings too. If it helps, maybe Clemson should take baby steps and rename other less focused on buildings, such as Schletter, the embezzler, Strom Thurmond, and some more. They all misrepresent what the university is about or is striving to be. And if it was a genuine cause, it wouldn't matter if many people knew about these individuals' past because they are not well looked upon, regardless of their contributions. I think these ones in particular should be especially renamed, because they aren't on the National Registry, and it would only take a vote by the board to change it. It's easy in comparison then. We could rename other buildings after women, Asian Americans, donors, famous alumni, presidents, trees, books, anything but a racist man.
So if we do this, are we covering up history? And if so, like, how do we ensure that we don't forget it?
No, we definitely aren't covering up history by doing this. We just simply aren't honoring a racist man any longer. We aren't proposing to get his name out of history books or brainwash people into thinking that he didn't exist. It's just he doesn't need to be glorified with such a beautiful building anymore. Like you said earlier, when you Google search Clemson, you see Tillman Hall.
Mm-hmm.
Many people don't know that he's a racist, but once you learn that, it's like, oh, the main building on campus glorifies a racist person. What does that say about us? So, yeah. And okay. Especially because he didn't build it. It was built after. And it's not used for what he donated money on. He was into agriculture. It's used for education now. There's no connection.
There. Okay.
Yeah. But if we do want to remember the good things he did for Clemson, he could certainly get a plaque in, like, the agriculture college.
That's true.
That's so true. I think overall, Ben Tillman was a very complicated man, but he was very into his ideals and fought for everything that he had. But the only issue is that some of his ideas, which might have been okay back then, is, like, certainly not okay now. So our question to you would be, with all the information that you have now heard, if it was worth the legal action to change the name. Along with this, is keeping the name considering covering up history, or are we just accepting history? So let us